Thank you. Okay, so first thing, like I said, I want to talk about what serous membranes are and make sure you understand the difference between visceral serous membrane, parietal serous membrane, and a cavity, which lies in between. All right, so I'm going to draw 4 organs here. I'm going to draw a lung, I'm going to draw the heart, and then I'm just going to draw the stomach as my example of an organ in the abdomen. Okay, so in the ventral cavity, that's the front cavity, right? I'm not talking about dorsal, brain, spinal cord. They don't have serous membranes. Serous membranes are exclusively associated with organs and structures in the ventral cavity. That's from here to here. Basically thoracic, abdominal, pelvic, okay? And it is an anterior region. Okay, so within this ventral cavity, all of your organs have linings associated with them, or membranes they're called. They're called serous membranes. And all of your serous membranes are 2 layers. They're double layered. It's one membrane, but it's got 2 layers to it, okay? And so each organ has a lining on the outside of it, like touching it, like directly on the outside of the organ, whether it's the lungs, the heart, or as an example in your abdomen, your stomach. Okay. Imagine that's touching. You get to do it. Okay. So this layer, this membrane around the organ, is the visceral layer of the serous membrane. And it has a different name depending on where the organ is. If it's associated with the lung, this layer is called the visceral pleura, an abbreviation. If it's around the heart, it's called the visceral pericardium. And if it's around an abdominal or pelvic organ, they all share the same name. It's called the visceral peritoneum. Okay? And again, this is just a membrane. It's made up of some epithelial tissue and connective tissue, and it just lines the outside of the organ. All right. Then there is a second layer, and it is not directly touching the visceral layer. It is more a little to the outside. So you can see, like, I'm kind of drawing like a halo around the visceral pleura, a halo around the visceral pericardium, and a halo around the visceral peritoneum. All right, this layer that is more external, more superficial, this is called the parietal layer. In this case, it's the parietal pleura. Obviously, you get it. Parietal pericardium, and this would be the parietal peritoneum. And I purposely am exaggerating the space in between because the space that exists between the serous membrane layers is a cavity. In the case of the lungs, it's the pleural cavity. In the case of the heart, it's the pericardial cavity, and obviously here, it's the peritoneal cavity. This cavity is filled with fluid. It's called serous fluid, and it is actually secreted by the 2 membranes. They secrete inward into this space, okay? And so that space is filled with fluid. What these membranes and the cavity they create filled with fluid do are a couple of things. First of all, they keep the outside of the organ wet and moist so that it decreases friction inside the space. Your organs are pretty crammed in there. Like when we look at pictures, they look all separated. But if you actually look at a cadaver, like they're really tightly packed and they're moving around, and we don't want them to rub up against each other, dry, and abrade each other. So having this fluid all around them keeps them nice and slick, and they just kind of slide past each other with very low friction. The other thing it does is, like say in the case of the lungs and the heart, these are super close together, right? Your lungs are here and your heart sits right in between. These membranes perform a function called compartmentalization. They keep the heart separate from the lung. They keep the right lung separate from the heart, the left lung separate from the heart, the two lungs separate from each other. And in your abdomen, they keep the heart in a little sac, and the intestine in a little sac, and the liver in a little sac, and they keep everything separate. And that is useful to help prevent the spread of disease. It doesn't always work. You can get cross-infection. But in most cases, like you get a lung infection, your heart's not going to be affected, right? And even though they're very close together, they're separated by these membranes and this compartmentalization. So I just wanted to make clear that everyone understood that. In the lab, I think on one drawing it says to identify the cavities, but also the serous membranes. If you need to go back and add those in, you can do that and return it in. These two cavities, the pleural cavity, which is just around each lung, and the pericardial around the heart, are both within the thoracic cavity, which is within the ventral cavity. You know, it's like Russian nesting dolls. Something, you know, we're just getting cavities inside of cavities. This peritoneal cavity is in the abdominopelvic cavity. It's deep to it, it's within it, and it's around each of the organs. Okay, any questions about that? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Sorry.
May I